Welcome, everybody. So this is my first author interview. I have Ian M. Rogers here. He is an excellent author. Obviously, I'm just going to say I've known you for quite a while now, which is excellent because you're much better than me. His new novel has come out now. His debut novel came out back in April. It is MFA Thesis Novel by Vine Leaves Press. So one of the reasons why I brought him on here, really probably the crux of it is very little is on the internet right now about the discussion of indie presses. If you go on YouTube, you can find plenty of information on things like traditional publishing, how that works with getting an agent in that process. There's plenty of things on self-publishing as well. Indie publishing is a bit of a kind of middle ground that you don't really see talked about a lot. So I wanted to get him on here to kind of discuss that, why he chose that, what the avenues are for authors, benefits and perhaps cons of going with that process. So Ian, I guess the main question would be, why did you go with an indie press?
First off, thank you for that excellent introduction. You definitely flatter me with all this, but yeah, it's a really good question. So a little bit about my background. So, I went to grad school. I got a master's in creative writing. I was working on a first novel. I tried to get published for a while, and then I started MFA Thesis Novel. Worked on that for a while, tried to get that published. In the grad school sort of academic writing world, small presses are a little bit bigger, basically because a lot of people are chasing after kind of that name recognition, that credibility that comes with having a press. In the academic world, there's much more of a stigma against self-publishing, kind of that old school, self-publishing's bad, which you don't see as much in genre fiction anymore. Readers just want a good sci-fi story, good romance, good horror, and so on. But in the academic, sort of literary fiction world, a lot of those stigmas are unfortunately still there. So within those circles, a lot of people will go for small presses, again, because they want that kind of, that sort of CV line or that extra bit of credibility.
Okay.
And again, this was my background, something I was a little bit more, a little more familiar with in that sense. So I worked on an MFA thesis novel for a while, and like a lot of writers submitted to agents first. You go through the query process, go through the cover letter, tried for a while, probably 9 months to a year, to get picked up by an agent. And I was not getting a lot of hits. I had exactly 0 manuscript requests on this book. In comparison, on my first book, I had about 4 with the same number of queries. So I was getting fewer manuscript requests at this point. And along the line, I'd gotten some personal feedback from agents, who I'd had a little bit more contact with. One, an agent that I had met through grad school, and another was an agent who had actually looked at my first book several years before. And both of those agents said the same thing, which was basically, your novel is too niche. There's not a big enough market for it. And I think part of this is the book itself. It's a book about writers. It's a book about grad school. But part of it was also the way that I pitched it. I think if I could go back in time, I'd pitch it a little bit differently. But both these writers said the same thing. It's more niche. And so that made me think about small presses a little bit more, because a lot of small presses, they do want to publish something that's a little bit more niche, that's going to maybe get overlooked by the bigger presses, so to speak.
I think that's a good point that you brought up with that. So if you're going to go into looking at indie presses, the 2 main things that you kind of highlighted was obviously the prestige is number one. I think you didn't mention name recognition, but I think it's the same thing of just saying prestige, which I've said the same thing as well, basically, and we both kind of went through MFA programs, and that's kind of drilled into you to a degree. Like I was always told, like, self-publishing, that could be where the money is, but traditional publishing is where the jobs are, right? Like if you want that, if you want to work in academia, if you want to do something, you need to go get traditionally published, basically. And but the other thing obviously is the niche part, right? Where if your writing is going to be traditionally published, but publisher doesn't see it as a wide enough audience to attract, well, we're not going to invest this money because it's going to be a loss for us. In that case, the indie publishing realm works well then. So for those that want the prestige, but also have the book that's a bit more for a much smaller audience, a much smaller demographic, going with that.
That's a good way of putting it. I think a lot of small presses now, they're sort of filling gaps that traditional presses are overlooking, because again, the audience is too small, or the market isn't big enough, or maybe it's a risk to take to take a gamble on a new writer who's writing a kind of story that's maybe not as formulaic as other kinds of stories. Maybe the writing is experimental in some form. Maybe there's something about the story that doesn't quite add up. It's not a lot of traditional publishing. It's based on what are called comps. The idea that you have to compare your book to existing books that have come before. And so the way that works is that, you get your list of, oh, my book is similar to X book, Y book, and Z book. And the agents, editors, who the acquisitions people, they'll of course look up the sales numbers for X book, Y book, and Z book and see, oh, okay, these books are pretty good. Maybe we could manage that. If sales are too low, I don't know about that, and so, and they'll look to those other books and look at how are those other books marketed? Who are they appealing to? Can we basically kind of copy their advertising strategy with this new book? Because again, a lot of publishing is kind of based on the success of what comes before. An example I give is, remember when the Twilight books got big, and all of a sudden after Twilight, there was a lot of paranormal romances that kind of got in there. It's because, people were publishers were looking for the next Twilight, so to speak.
Gotcha. No, you're exactly correct. And that's often I think you're exactly right. Like the main thing of indie press as well, potentially springboarding. You're talking about the numbers, you're discussing the idea of people looking at different algorithms, doing well with like an indie press. That way you could potentially springboard into maybe landing that agent when you have perhaps a book that's a bit more broad, that's designed basically for a much wider sort of audience on the second go around. If your success does well, or moderate success with a much smaller press and much smaller book at first, kind of way to test the waters. It's a good way to look at that too. I always think back to I make these connections all the time, but when I was a kid, I used to love Howard Stern, and he always talked about the fact that his biggest thing he ever did in his career was he got a radio job in small markets first, like small dying radio markets, because you can only go up. You can I can bring in maybe like a 10% increase in your audience. Maybe I look great, even though it's not a whole lot. It's a 10% increase, and then I can just move up. It's kind of the same thing with indie press, where your first book goes through that, do well, learn to promote it, learn to market it, and then your next one that maybe has a bit of a wider audience, reach out to the agents there. They'll see a track record of success on the first one, and then boom, you have a much more leveraged skill going into the second one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example with Howard Stern, the small radio markets. I think that a lot of times agents, editors, when they see an unknown writer with either 0 publishing credits or a handful of short story publication credits, publishing their novel is going to be a risk for them. Maybe the writer has a really small platform, it's they only have so many followers, they don't have a name out there, and so the risk for the publisher goes up. Being on an indie press, I have found, has been a great way to build my platform as somebody who went from having 0 books to having 1 book, which is a really, really big jump. Now I have a book that I can show people. The book is by a reputable press. People can see it on Amazon. I can put it on my website. It goes on my Twitter and so on. And so it's a way to build that platform, and the indie press was my way of getting that book, getting that credibility, getting that chance.
Bingo. And it's that type of idea of using this basically as a way to kind of grow yourself is huge. Like exactly, no, that's a good way of saying it, because I think there are people that might watch this video that might be like, think maybe I don't know, if I can't get like an agent, get the big 5, I won't do it at all. I'll self-publish basically at that point, or I won't do it at all, because it's like all or nothing. People get it. I use the terminology. I don't know if it's offensive, but I use the virginity analogy of like, I'm gonna lose my virginity. You sound like a guy. Seriously, you sound like a guy who's like, I'm gonna lose my virginity to this amazing supermodel. Like, I'm gonna hold out until I meet the supermodel. I'm gonna have sex with her for the first time. Like, or reverse it, woman, guy, whatever. Right? As opposed to like having the growth mindset of, hey, it doesn't matter where the first one comes out. This book found a home. I have the skills to produce another book. This next one's going to be better. And over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to see a growth in audience. You're going to see a growth in publishers. You're going to see a growth in my skill as a writer and more entertaining books. And that's where the the money, leveraging the film rights, if you get big enough, whatever, come in at that point. The first one does not need to be
Yes.
the one,
The
Um,
the virginity example is of course demeaning towards women, but then in the writing sense, it's demeaning towards yourself. The idea that
yes,
you put it on this pedestal. I think a lot of writers have this dream that once I sign this book contract or get the agent or whatever, all your dreams are magically going to come true. And
bingo.
I think sort of getting that publication deal, that's just the beginning. It's like it's like a new step on the journey, so to
Absolutely.
speak. And I think it's, again, it really is a mistake to see traditional publishing, big press, agent publishing as the be all end all. And I
Bingo.
also think it's a mistake to see that kind of, oh, traditionally published or self-published. I either, have them do everything for me or do everything myself. I think in the
Exactly.
real world, there's a lot more stuff that exists sort of in the area between that.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, I feel like too, is just learning how to do it. Like you learn how to write. With this, you're also learning how to market. You're learning how to promote. Like people
Yes.
that write their books first, like they don't know how to do that. They
Yep.
don't know how to do, like, hell, I don't even, like, even with this, like I'm trying to figure out how to use social media with this, you know what I mean?
Well, no, I
And
think you do a very good job, and I think
oh,
this
thanks.
YouTube channel itself is the type of social media outreach platform building that a lot of small and large presses want to see.
Right.
They want to see more stuff like that. I think it's easier to do stuff like this if you have a book, if you have a network, if you have connections, and I think these kinds of smaller steps, these kinds of the equivalent of the Howard Stern rural small market radio outlets are ways to make that happen little by little. I think marketing's hard. It's very hard. You have to figure out how to do it. You have to figure out the marketing that works for you. And the
Hmm.
best way to do it, I mean, you could, of course, you read the books, you listen to the podcast, you figure it out, but then really just getting it in yourself and promoting yourself with what you have now, even
Yeah.
if it's very little, even if it's like, oh, I got this piece published in, this journal, or, I made this zine myself, or I self-published something on issue.
Yeah. And
There's a lot that you can do.
exactly. And it's such a weird field basically with writing because it seems like the only one where the idea of working up is not like encouraged at all. Like
Mhm.
or people go basically without the mentality of working up. Like any other industry, like if you're a band, you always
Yeah.
know you're going to start out playing. With writing, it's always weird. Like it's always like you want to play in the majors right off the bat. And
Yeah.
I said this before myself. I'm as much of a victim as anyone that perhaps we're addressing on this video. I mean, I've talked about how my first short stories no one's ever going to see because if I couldn't get into the big, freaking I could get Paris review at the, Atlantic, whatever. I I was not going to ever get it out. Like it's either there or nothing. Um, but we talked about marketing as well. So I do want to start jumping into that too, because I do think you do
Mhm.
marketing really, really well in comparison to other authors that I've seen. Um, so we'll get into that next.